thank Mary for inviting me over to talk a little bit about deer and what I've experienced over my career. I have given this talk several times. I keep tweaking a little bit because new stuff comes about, and I like to keep it updated. I'd like to start out by saying I had never had any apprehension of ever being in the position I'm in. I grew up as a son of a deer hunter in Charlotte County, and I loved deer and I wanted to work with deer. And when I was 32 years old, I had my dream job at DNR, being the deer biologist, and I had 15 great years there. I should say 13 great years there at DNR, doing what I love to do. And the last 2 years were a little bit tumultuous, to say the least. And when I realized I couldn't make any more change there, I pulled the pin. I'm quite frustrated that we aren't able to talk about this in a public forum or even in any kind of scientific way at all. It's people that own the media do what they do, and you don't get the chance to say what you think. And it's very, very frustrating because people are only getting part of the picture. So I do this to try to give you another side of the picture. And again, if all the public thinks that spraying's great, fill your boots. Don't matter hill beans to me. But people need to know both sides of it. Yes, it works. It kills hardwood trees, which is exactly what people want to do. And if I was a forester, I'd think that's great. But I'm not a forester. Well, I am a forester, but I'm also a wildlife biologist. And I know the other side of the equation, and I'm going to try to give you a little bit of what I've seen in the past. Now, I start with this slide because there's an old, well, it's not a wives' tale, it's actually true. If you put a frog in a kettle of boiling water, he knows right off the bat, this ain't good, and he jumps out of the water. But if you put a frog in a kettle of warm water, he thinks this is kind of nice, and he swims around, and you can gradually turn the heat up, and because the change is so gradual and so slow, he'll stay there and boil to death. And in my mind, that's exactly what's happened to us with deer. Is basically that this change has come about so slowly, people haven't realized what's going on until now. You start looking at the numbers, and you look at the people beside us, and you realize there's no deer. Well, what's going on? What happened to the deer? And I'll explain to you what I've seen over my career. So people say I'm trying to shut down the forest industry. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I was raised on blue-collar pulp mill dollars in St. Stephen. My dad worked for a pulp mill company down there as a diesel mechanic. And I'm a lumberjack, and I'm okay. You don't get that. I am seriously a lumberjack. I chop wood, and I'll be down here at the Boys Town Woods Museum this weekend trying to chop wood there. But I don't have a problem with that at all. But what I think is, when I started talking about this issue, it was, oh, they shut up, we don't want to hear about you, that's not true, you're unprofessional, you're unscientific. Whoa, back the truck up. Nobody has a monopoly here on running the show, and people like us that have concerns should be able to speak to this issue. And I think that's the biggest thing you should be concerned about, is there is no opportunity for the public to talk about how our public forest and public wildlife is utilized. And that, in my mind, is unbelievable. But people seem to be okay with that, which also blows my mind. Now, I went to school in forestry. I did a Bachelor of Science in Forestry. I was there from 85 to 90. And back then, we had woodstock models, and we could actually plug all the data into the models and run it and see what was going to happen to the forest inventory over time. And we knew in 1985 that we would be right where we are now in 25 years. Our professors told us that. We were going to run out of wood on Crown land in 25 years. They knew that. If we keep cutting the way and even though we're supposed to be harvesting sustainably, that's what they say we are doing, but they all said we will run out of wood, there's going to be a wood shortage in 25 years. And of course, I was alive to see it. That's exactly what happened. So this isn't a big secret that we run out of wood. Anybody in the forest industry knew that was going to happen. So knowing that was going to happen, back when I started working in 1990 at the Fish and Wildlife Branch, we knew that was going to happen. So what us biologists did back then, we knew that certain wildlife species need habitat. Actually, all wildlife species need habitat. So we said, well, let's look at the requirements of every species and make sure that when this crunch comes, we have enough forest out there to maintain our species of wildlife, which sounds like a pretty reasonable thing to do. So we did that. Us big game guys, we started flying the province and looking where the deer yards are because we knew mature forest is what was going to be in short supply. So what needed mature forest? Well, deer needed mature forest up this high north because they went there in the winter times in deer yards, and that's how they got through our tough winters, was in these deer yards. So we flew the landscape and we mapped where all these deer yards were on crown land, and we said, okay, well, we're going to need these down the road. So we drew lines around them all, and everybody knew where they were, and the forestry companies couldn't harvest in them unless they had a management plan designed for the deer yard. That was approved by our biologists. The fish people did the same thing. They looked at it and saw, well, we know if they harvest too close to the rivers and streams, we get a lot of siltation, the temperature of streams go up, so we want to keep them away from the streams. So the fish people put buffers on streams. And all these things that we did, the deer yards, the buffer strips, all those things is what makes up the conservation forest. And there's been a lot of talk about the conservation forest the last few years, but people don't realize what it is. Okay, the conservation forests are all these areas that us biologists set aside to say we need it to protect our wildlife and our fish species. So it used to be at 35%, then it went to 30%, and of course with this new deal in 2014 it went down to 23%. Okay, and that's too low. Because we did the bare minimum of 30%. Okay, and even at that level, I'll show you in a bit, it had impacts, and we'll talk about it. So, if people look back and look around the room with the gray hair here, like me, we can all remember the glory days of deer in the province. Okay, back in the 80s, okay? Actually in the 60s, when I was a little fella, the 60s, we had a harvest of 31,000 deer in the early 60s. And then of course we had a couple of severe winters, and winters do play a role. Herd crashed, and then we had some good winters, and all of a sudden by 1985 again, we were up harvesting 31,000 deer again. Okay, so there was potential, if things were good, the deer herd could grow and we would harvest over 30,000 deer in Brunswick. And it was really the perfect storm because we had the right amount of everything out there. We had the right amount of mature stuff. We had all kinds of guys out there in the ground with skidders and chainsaws cutting, and there's lots of little cuts around. And when you cut the Acadia forest where we live, when you cut that forest, the next 2 years, all kinds of new growth comes up. It's all what we call early successional species. They're all the hardwood trees that have to grow fast to get the light because they can't grow in the shade. Now softwood species like spruce and balsam fir can grow in the shade. So after you cut an area, everything would be there, little spruce trees, little fir trees, and all the hardwoods, but the hardwoods would grow quickly. And they'd take advantage of the sunlight, and the spruce and fir trees that could handle it in the shade would stay there and then just grow slowly, slowly. And over time, the birch trees and the poplar trees would get up there and they'd be big trees, and then the spruce and fir would be this high underneath them, and eventually they'd die because they only lived to be 60, 80 years old, and then of course all the softwood species take over. So it's quite a long, drawn-out process if you let things go naturally. And what they realize is after a while, if you actually spray those hardwoods, you get those little green trees up there a whole lot faster. But in the 60s and 80s, we didn't do that. We didn't do a whole lot of spraying. We let everything happen naturally. We'd harvest, and then things would rebound, and of course we had all this hardwood out there in the ground. We had all kinds of hardwood from one end of the province to the other because we didn't spray that. So we had all kinds of mature stuff because that's what they were going to be cutting from the 80s until now. That's what's made our forest industry thrive, is all this mature wood that we've cut the last 30 years. So, we had the best of everything, which is why we had really good deer populations from the 60s to the 80s. So what's happened since then? What's happened since the 80s? Since 1985 when we had harvested 31,000 deer. Well, there's been changes in how the forest is harvested. We've gone from using men on the ground with chainsaws to using processors. And guys with chainsaws can only work from sunup till sundown. Processors now, if you know it, the guys that buy them, they've got a huge investment, and they run them 24/7 to pay for them. They have to. So we've gone from, the intensity of harvesting has increased dramatically. The other thing that's changed is how the forest is regenerated. We always talk about this annual allowable cut. Whenever you hear forestry guys talking, we always talk about this annual allowable cut. We allow them to cut so much wood, but only enough that they can regenerate it and grow it again in the future. Now what increases the annual allowable cut is if you do this silviculture, if you plant trees and spray them. That makes a whole lot of wood volume come online a whole lot faster so they can cut more now because you know there's going to be more wood down the road. So and that's why they say we cannot let go of this spraying because it's integral to what they're doing. In order to cut a lot right now, they have to be doing that, okay, so that there's a lot more stuff coming up in the future. So it's all linked. But what happened is we've gone from letting the forest grow back naturally with all this hardwood to removing that hardwood. And no one's ever assessed what impact does that have on our wildlife. And to this date, no one's done it. So we've changed the intensity, speed, and size of cuts. That's what we've done. Okay, a lot larger cuts now. We can cut a lot faster, and there's a lot more of them out there across the landscape. So this is a chart that shows plantations and herbicides since the 1960s, early 60s up to 2007 or 8 out there. And you can see in the 60s and 70s there wasn't much done, but in the 80s things started happening. And of course we had great deer populations up until here. And then from here things started declining. So, and maybe it's coincidental it happened then, but I think there's a little bit more to it. But nonetheless, that's when it started. So in the mid-80s, late 80s, we really started doing a lot of planting and spraying. And DNR will tell you on average, it's right here, 12,000 hectares, and that last few years it's been 14,000 and 15,000 hectares. So we've actually increased that the last few years. And we'll have to continue to do that to maintain the level of harvesting we're doing now, because in 2014 with the new forestry agreement, the level of harvesting went up again. So we're harvesting even more. In order to maintain that, they've got to plant and spray more. So, I was just being a deer guy. I was giving out dope permits and doing all that kind of stuff and just going about my job, and I never really thought much about this whole issue. Okay? In 2000, we actually changed the deer management system, and I said, we're going to grow the deer herd because we were at 31,000 once, 31,000 again, and then in 2000, we were harvesting right around 4,000 to 5,000 deer, and I said, this is brutally dismal. The hunters wanted more deer, I wanted more deer, so I said, we're going to drop the doe tags, and we are going to grow this deer herd in New Brunswick, which we did. If you remember back, we grew from 2000 to 2007, but where we got to was a lot different than where we were the 2 times before that. 2 times before that, we harvested 31,000 deer. In 2007, we harvested 10,000. 1/3 of what we did 2 times previous. And when that happened, I said, what is going on? The other thing that happened was where the harvest was, while we were growing the deer herd was growing and growing, and all of a sudden we started getting a ton of complaints. There's deer in my raspberries, there's deer in my apple trees, there's deer in Rossay Quispam Cis, there's deer in the Tobic, there's deer every place, people didn't want them. And I thought, well, this ain't good. I'm trying to grow a deer herd and nobody's happy with it. And the hunters couldn't get into hunting. So something was going on. But really the first red flag to me was in 2003. I got a call from a guy down in St. Stephen. He worked for Department of Transportation. Ernie Hatt was his name. And he called up and he was livid. There's no deer out here in the Macadavy country. Why is there no deer in the Macadavy country? And I said, well, it's not rocket science. Macadavy is right in the middle of Charlotte County, the southernmost zone of the province. If we're going to have deer anywheres in a province where we have tough winters, we should be able to grow some deer in Charlotte County. When I was a young fellow, we harvested 4,000 deer out of Charlotte County alone. Last year, we harvested 4,000 deer in the entire province. Okay, just to give you an idea of how things have changed. So I told Ernie, I said, listen, I don't know why there's no deer there. First of all, I'm not sure there's no deer there, but I'll go talk to our habitat guys that manage the habitat side of this thing and find out what's going on. So I went and talked to them, and I said, guys, what's going on with the habitat down in Zone 20, around the Macadavy Lake area, or Macadavy River area? So they got all their maps out, and looked at it and said, oh, there's a cut here, and there's a cut here. There's 40 different cuts here, Rod. There's all kinds of deer food. So I called Ernie back and said, Ernie, there's all kinds of cutting down there. Oh, there's no end to cutting, he said down here. There's no end to cutting, but there's no deer. So I said, well, rather than just think everything's okay, that winter, myself and another biologist, we said, let's go scoot these cuts and take a look at them. So we did. And I scooted every one of those cuts. And we looked at what was growing in those cuts. And what we found was 67% of all those 40 stands that were supposed to have all kinds of deer food, 67% of them were plantations. And I'm not sure how many people have been in a plantation. I usually assume everybody understands that a plantation is just evergreen trees. But I think that's not a safe assumption. If you don't understand what a plantation looks like, get out of your car and walk through one. So you really know that there is nothing in there but softwood trees. Because I get foresters and biologists all the time telling me, oh, there's hardwood there. Oh, the hardwood sprouts back. And I'm thinking, what flipping province are you in? It does not happen. I fly these. I've flown those for years. And I'd like to see this hardwood because it is not there. But anyhow, 95% were stocked with evergreens. And we have all kinds of data in there that shows the same thing. Okay, so if anybody wants to argue that point, I will give you all kinds of data you can look at to show you that this is exactly what happens. 16% of these areas were poor sites. So they were either ericaceous species, which is like lambkill, blueberries, not very good growth, and usually jack pine grows there, so they're not really good sites. And 17% of what was out there was what I'd call good deer food. So I thought, well, that explains it to me. There's only, of all this land that they think is providing all kinds of deer food, only 17% is actually producing good deer food. So we go from 100% down to, well, that tells me that, guess what, there's not a lot of food there for deer. So how in the world can you grow a lot of deer? There's nothing there for them to eat. So that made sense in my mind. I went back and I told the guys that gave me the maps, I said, fellas, you told me there's all kinds of food here. Well, guess what? There isn't. Okay? Stop saying there's lots of food out there until you go and measure it. And they said, yeah, thanks a lot, Rod. See you around. So anyways, I said, fine. No, they don't care. They're the habitat guys. They don't care about it. I don't care about it. So I just kept doing what I do. So then what happened is, we were doing our deer yard stuff, and of course, around 2008, 2009, the forestry companies started coming after us. They need more wood. They need more wood. We need more wood. Because of course we were coming into that 25-year low. Remember, 25 years down the road, we were going to run. Well, that was it. 2008, 2009, we were running out of wood. We need more woods to feed our mills. And guess what? All these deer yards you guys have set aside, there's no deer in them. We want to cut them. And I said, whoa, whoa, baby, back the truck up. We've saved these deer yards for right now. If deer come back, they're going to need that. No, we're not going to cut it. Well, not everybody in the department shared my perspective on that. Actually, I was the only guy that really made a big fuss. So I told them, I said, well, if the habitat guys, they said, well, you know, there are a lot of deer yards with no deer in them. Why don't we trade those off for places where we know there are deer? And I said, well, why, if we've saved all these deer yards, why is there no deer in them? We don't know. So I said, well, I'm going to go try to find out. So I did. I went up north. I found a nice big deer yard complex outside of Bathurst. And me and my little girl then, she was 6 or 7 years old, we went up, it was minus 30 degrees or something. I said, we're going to find out what's going on up here. So I did the same thing I did down in Charlotte County. I drove around and I looked at every one of the cuts and recorded what was growing there. Look at the numbers. This is in Bathurst. 60% of the regeneration out there was plantations. 90 to 95% stocked with evergreen trees. Very, very little hardwood. 20% were poor sites, wet sites, rocky sites, just miserable sites, but not much growing there. And less than 20% were what I call good deer browsing. So I thought, well, it's no surprise that this deer yard is vacant because there's nothing there for deer to eat. Why would deer stay there and starve to death? Or maybe they did stay there and did starve to death, and now that's why there's no deer there. But it was amazing that I went to 2 different places in the north and south of the province and I found the same thing. So I told the guys again, hey fellas, I went up to a deer yard and I looked at what was growing there and there was no food there. And they said, no, listen, it's cover, cover, cover. We need to have mature forest for cover for deer yards. It's not about food. There's all kinds of food out there. And I said, have you ever quantified that? No, well, no. We just know that. I said, you don't know nothing. Go out and quantify it. Until you do, you don't know what you're saying. So this is what's happened. And up until the 80s, when you cut an area, this is what happened. There's all kinds of hardwood browse, and you can hardly even walk through it. I remember my dad, when he used to hunt clearcuts, used to take a step ladder up when they got up to this height, so he could actually sit on the step ladder up above the hardwoods. And he would just sit in the middle of a hardwood of a cut like this, and watch deer and pick one out that he wanted and shoot it. And I could still hear him clang, clang, going into the cut, that step ladder, aluminum step ladder, clang, clang, set it up there, and once he sat up there, it was easy pickings. And this is what we have now. Okay, that's what we have. So that's a huge change. If people don't understand that change, there's something wrong. There's a huge change there. So the next thing that happened is we were flying deer yards, and we were flying about 7 to 10 wildlife management zones every year and counting moose and deer. And all throughout the 2000s when we were trying to grow the deer herd. And what I realized is we'd be flying along and we'd be seeing a moose here and a deer there and a moose here and a deer there, and then we'd fly along and you wouldn't hear a thing in the helicopter. Nobody was seeing anything. And I'd look out the window and we'd be flying over that. And after a while, when we got to a plantation, the guys would lean back and they'd eat something, and I said, well, guys, we're doing a survey, you gotta look out the window. They say, there's nothing, Rod, you know there's nothing in these plantations. Why are we bothered? Let's just take a breather, we'll stretch our necks and everything, then we'll go back and count deer and moose when we know they're gonna be there. Because there's nothing in these plantations. So, and every time we started flying, I started looking at this a lot more, and I started saying, okay, well, where are these plantations? And then when I'd see areas with all this hardwood, I started looking at my map book and say, okay, well, who owns that land? And every time I saw something where there was a lot of hardwood growing, it belonged to private landowners. And every time I saw the plantations, it belonged to the government, to Crown land. And I thought, boys, this is starting to make sense to me. Like, things are very different in how we're managing these two forests. I said the same thing back then. I said, guys, you know what? I think there's a problem. And I went to our senior guy and said, I think there's a problem. And they said, yeah, thanks a lot, Rod. So, I had this big battle. They kept saying there's all kinds of, actually the last time we got in this big battle with the guy that was my boss, he said, I just drove from Fredericton to Campbellton and I saw all kinds of deer food along the road. And I said, you're kidding me, right? Like I'm flying over the woodland all the time, and you took one drive and I'm full of it. Anyhow, The biggest thing is nobody ever quantified changes in available deer browse. So I was there, this was from 2009 to 2012 before I left, and I said, well, we must have that data here somewhere. And I get along good with most people in the department, so I called up a buddy of mine in timber management. I said, what do you got up there for regen data? Oh, we got all kinds of regen data. I said, hey, send her down, here you go. Excel files, everything that was regenerating, I had it, all of it. So there was all the regenerating stands since 1990 he sent me. I was missing data from 2003 to 2006. This was in 2009, 10 I was doing it. So I was missing a little bit because they hadn't yet interpreted it. So they didn't say what was actually growing there, so I couldn't use it. But even still, from 1990 to 2002, so that's 12 years, there was 19,000 stands, regenerating stands that they had data on, 200,000 hectares. I thought, that's a pretty good sample size. Let's look at that. Okay, so that's what's happened all throughout the 90s into the early 2000s. This is what we did. So I looked at it, and of course, whenever I talk to the guys up in timber management, other people, I'd say, well, you know, how much do we herbicide? Oh, less than 1%, right? So little. Don't even worry about it. So I said, okay, well, it's 1% of the ground in the whole province. So they try to, I'm surprised they look at how much is sprayed in Canada because it would even be smaller than that. They try to make that number look really small. But I said, if you push them and say, okay, well, of all we cut, how much is sprayed? And if you push them, they'll say, well, it's about 25% of what we cut, we spray. And I get that number quite regularly from the foresters in there. And I said, so I started looking at the number of stands. So I took all these regenerating stands and I said, okay, well, how many of these things are sprayed? And actually, if I looked at the number of stands, it was 30%. So it was higher than what they were saying. But if I looked at the area out there on the ground, it was actually almost 40% of the area. Okay, so one stand might be a big stand. If it's sprayed, then that makes up a lot more of the land base. So all of a sudden it was 40%. So all of a sudden the numbers that they were telling me, now when I looked at the real data, it was a lot more than that. And I thought, okay, people don't understand what's going on here. So the two things that really started to wind me up about this is even when I talked to other wildlife biologists, they would quote studies from Maine and say, Rod, hardwoods bounce back in these clear cuts, in these plantations once they're sprayed. And I said, what? They said, oh yeah, they bounce back. And I'm thinking, I fly over these things every winter, and I never see hardwoods everywhere through these things. It doesn't exist. If the hardwoods would bounce back and grow in these plantations, they wouldn't have the volume in them. They wouldn't be able to cut at the high level of AAC that they do. Everything would fail. They know it works, which is why we keep doing it. It does kill all the hardwoods. And if they do bounce back, they spray it again. And 35% of all the plantations that are sprayed once are sprayed a second time if hardwoods come back. Because they want to make sure there's 95% of the area is stocked with evergreen trees. And if you're a forester, that's a smart thing to do. I don't blame them for that. But don't tell me that there's hardwoods up there. The only place you'll see hardwoods in plantations is wherever a tree is fallen down and sunlight hits the ground, because again, they're shade intolerant. They have to grow where there's sunlight. Or along the edges where the sun can get at it. That's where your hardwoods grow. Every place else where there's shade, hardwoods can't grow. It's that simple. The second thing is the deer use plantations. Now, how many guys here hunt? Okay, now how many of you guys have your tree stand in a plantation? And you're laughing because it is foolish. We know there's no deer there. We're not going to put a tree stand in a plantation because the deer aren't there. It's that simple. So, but yet, you'll read this stuff. You'll read it in the papers next time. When this hits the paper tomorrow or whatever this does, you'll read that again. Somebody from industry or the department will say, oh no, it's bouncing back and no, it's with the deer. So, when I started plotting this stuff and looking at the data, they fill plant. This is all what they fill plant right here. So fill planting means they go out and they do a regen survey and they count the number of little green trees. And if there's not enough softwood trees there, then they'll put more little green trees in the ground. So whatever that was 10 or 15%, they actually fill plant. This is what they consider a plantation. It's the stuff that they full plant. And that was a sizable chunk. And then this stuff here, this yellow, is stuff that grows back naturally, but there's not a lot of deer. It's pin cherry, it's great birch, it's stuff that deer don't eat. And no one has gone out and quantified that. I know I've said that several times, but I want you to understand that. Nobody has quantified this. All they'll say is, we spray 20%, which means the other 80% is great for deer. And I hear that all the time from DNR guys, and I think, hold it, guys. Have you gone out and measured it? No one has. I did this, so that's why I did this. So all of a sudden, what might be potentially good for deer is about 39.6% on the entire land base, which is a huge reduction in what we used to have. And if there's that much of a reduction in what's available for deer, how can we say it doesn't impact deer? Like that, anyways, without belaboring that point, that just drives me bananas. So I said, okay, they're not getting it. Because I started showing this and they said, yeah, that's right, Rob, but there's still a lot of food up there. There's still a lot of food. And I said, I got to put this in terms people are going to understand. So, deer consume on average 2 kilograms of feed per day. The average deer consumes about 2 kilograms. We spray 13,000 hectares, or 32,000 acres, with glyphosate. Now, obviously, it's less than 1%. Well, 32,000 acres. Anybody own a woodlot that big? Okay, that is a flippin'. I'd love to have a woodlot that small. Okay, 32,000 hectares, give me a break, that's a lot of wood. Okay? So, if you look at the research, there's all kinds of research that shows in the naturally regenerating stand, 20 to 40,000 stems per hectare are deer browse are produced there. That is a lot of deer food. And if deer nibble it back, and it grows, it sprouts from each side, it grows again, so you almost double what's there. So in the first 10 to 15 years of a cut, there's a ton of food there, and then if deer are eating it, they're going to produce a lot more because it doesn't, the terminal bud's gone, so the lateral bud's grown, you get 2 or 3 shoots off it. There's a ton of browse out there. And anybody that's ever been in the deer yard, you see that, okay? You see these little hardwood trees, browse down, and there's 3 or 4 different shoots coming off it. So, I went out and I cut a whole bunch of these twigs down to about that size that a deer would actually eat in the winter. I weighed them all to see how much they'd weigh, and I figured out, it's quite easy math, that these 20 to 40,000 stems will produce basically a ton of food per acre. That's what you can grow on an acre of regenerative forest, is a ton of deer food. So, in 1 year, we removed 32,000 tons of deer food from crown land. And 32,000 tons of deer food will feed 32,000 deer. And we remove it every single year. So again, they say that it's unscientific, the numbers aren't justified, but this is exactly what deer do. Okay, that's exactly how much they eat a day, that's exactly what we produce in the clear cut, and that's exactly what we remove. Actually, it's more than that. I use these numbers conservatively so that they can't say, oh, you're blowing out of proportion, because no, I'm not. And they know that, and nobody argues these numbers. So we've removed enough food on crown land to feed 32,000 deer every year, year after year after year for the last 30 years. But it doesn't have an impact on deer. Whatever. So it's almost 1 million tons, enough food to feed 1 million deer. But it doesn't have an impact on deer. So the potential for herd growth. The other thing that has happened, so when we start talking about plantations, if you start looking into it, you'll realize that all of a sudden it's not just as simple as going out and planting these little green trees anywhere, because that's an investment. So I was at a meeting back in whenever it was, 2011 or 12, and I was at a table with some other guys from Irving and other places, and we started talking about plantations and where they were planting, and they said, you know, oh, you guys are turning hardwood ridges into softwood plantations. Oh, no, we plant the best sites. I said, what? They said, oh yeah, they said, we look at the site index, and there's something called a site index, where they go out and look at what the soil type is like. And some soil types, and we know, in the woods, some trees grow a lot bigger on certain ground than others, because it's a lot richer ground. And the foresters know this, and they go out and they sample all the ground, and the stuff that's most rich, the best sites, that's what they plant. Because they know they're going to get most return for their investment on the trees, which is a smart thing to do. So on the crown land, we're planting the richest, the best sites in plantations as well. Okay? All those good sites is what they're planting, and the other stuff, the stuff they're leaving to regenerate on its own, is stuff that's poor anyhow. Or it's wet, or it's rocky, or it's ericaceous, or it's not good to plant. So they're not going to bother with it. So that's what they're leaving and saying, oh, that's good for deer. Okay, well, before you say that, you need to measure what that is. So no analysis has been done of that. The last big effort to grow the deer herd, remember, from 2000 to 2007, and the herd did grow, and it grew 1/3 of what it was before. And that tells me there's not enough room out there to grow the deer. In order to get 30,000 deer again, we need all the land base in New Brunswick. And half of it is crown land, and that half has been really changed as far as what it can support. And of course, where the herd grows is a lot different. As I said before, it's on crown land. So is there other evidence? That's what I've seen. Is there any other thing that corroborates that? Well, back when we started, the last few years we flew the aerial survey, we flew up in the northwest. And we were flying counting moose in zones 1 and 2, and we had to hover the helicopter because we were counting so many moose. 200 and some moose on one flight. It was unbelievable, the moose. And I said, what is going on up here? And of course, the guys that were flying with me, the DNR staff, said, well, it's very obvious what's going on. They said, Acadia timber is going to sell out. And if you saw the papers last year, you saw Acadia timber for sale. Surprise, surprise. Our staff said that 5 years ago. They said what they're doing, they're just going in and cutting everything, and they're not planting, they're not spraying, they're not investing anything in the woodlands. They're getting out of business. They're just making as much money as they can, and they're peeling out. And they told us that. And of course, when I looked at the herbicide maps, this is a map I got off the internet that DNR put on there. Now, whether this is just 1 year or I don't know what it's from, it's just they have no labels on it. It's
2013.
It's just for that 1 year? Okay, so if that's what it is, that's where they sprayed in 2013. But you see up here, this is zone 1, this is zone 2. This here is private land, this is Irving's Blackbrook area. And then this here is Irving's, the old Bullwater ground, so that's not there because they don't tell you what they do on that. But this part here is not sprayed. Very, very little. And it's been like that for about 10, they just started spraying the last 2 years because we have some students at the ranger school that have worked there that said, guess what, Rob, they're starting to spray there again. But they hadn't for quite a while. Now, I want to show you some things, because whenever we start talking about this, certain people say, well, it's winters and coyotes that dictate what goes on with deer. Okay, so remember that when I start telling you this. So, this here is a province. This is a number of angler days for a number of brook trout. So this is a catch per unit effort. It takes into account the decline. If you look at the rod days, you'll see that they decline. So the number of fishermen out there is declining. But if you do a catch per unit effort, that standardizes that. So this is how many trout each guy out there catches. And you can see there's a downward decline. It's stayed relatively the same till, 85. What a coincidence. And all of a sudden, number of brook trout declining. Now, that's across the province in general. Let's look at in 2007, they did a blue card survey to look at where are all the fish being caught. Brook trout harvested for Angler Day. I'm surprised. Well, that's up there. That's just a coincidence maybe. But anyways, that's where the best brook trout are in the province. Right now, catch per unit effort. This is by recreational fish area, Upper St. John River, the same thing, zones 1 and 2. I just find that's very coincidental that all of a sudden we have a lot more fish in that area than we do in the rest of the province. Maybe that's a coincidence. Deer harvest trends. Now, deer, we know deer grow better. We've always heard, the severe winters is what hurts deer a lot. Well, the winters in the south, and you ask any biologist, anybody out there, they'll tell you the winters in the south are a lot easier than they are in the north. So this is deer herd growth the last 5 years from 2010 to 2015. This is deer herd growth in the south. So this is zone 22. This is the breadbasket. This is agriculture ground down around Sussex. And there has been a little bit of growth there, but it's back down again last year. The rest of the south, look at that. Hardly any growth at all in deer. This is in the southern part of the province. Don't forget that. This is central New Brunswick. This is zone 16. This is where I'm at, in agricultural belt. And there was a bit of growth there, and it dropped last year with the tough winter, but still, a little bit of growth there. 16, the reason that is because it's an agricultural belt. This is central New Brunswick. Same thing, a little bit of growth, not a whole lot. Zone 10, though, is getting very close to zone 2. Okay, it's just right underneath it. And there was a little bit of growth there. That's also an agricultural belt. Zone 10, that's Carleton County. Okay, we know about the agriculture there. This is zones 1 and 2. The far northwest of the province where winters are most severe. Look at the growth, over 100% increase in the last 5 years. Where's this winter effect that we keep hearing about? Winters are what causes the problem with deer. This is the worst place in the province for winters, and all of a sudden our deer herd has grown over 100% in the last 5 years. Maybe it's a coincidence. I don't know. Whoop. Let's go back here. Moose. Let's look at moose. That's deer. Let's look at moose. So this is southern New Brunswick. Not a good sign. And actually, we're going to see this. The next 10 years, you're going to watch deer and moose numbers do this. We're going to see that in the central and southern part of the province. So that's what we're seeing here already the last 5 years in the south. Holding their own in the far 18, 19, 25. That's over by Moncton. This is central New Brunswick again, just holding their own. This is northwest New Brunswick, zone 1 and 2. 237 to 443% increase in moose in that part of the province. It must be just a coincidence. Trout, deer, and moose in an area where it's not sprayed. That's what nobody's looking at it though. Nobody's studying the thing. Why did that happen in the Northwest? I'm not sure if you guys knew or not, but St. Quentin had a big problem with this spray program a few years ago. And they let people know about it. This was one day, this was the next. And all of a sudden, the Katy Timber, they don't spray because they realize if we spray, we get in a whole pile of trouble. Okay, they burnt the chopper, the spray chopper. Burn it flat. Okay, and all of a sudden, spraying up there stopped. Actually, this was during it. They actually had stopped it even before this. They made it known we don't want spraying to happen here. So this is what we saw. Every time we flew up there, all these cuts, they were just filled with hardwoods. And moose are a little bit smarter than deer. I don't know why deer don't do this, but moose, they'll feed up when the stuff is this high in the cut, they can reach it all. When it gets higher than that, they just walk over top of it. They bend it over and they keep eating the tops of them. So moose can actually survive in a cut a lot longer than deer because they're a little bit, I know it's hard to believe they're smarter than moose, but when it comes to feeding, they are. So then, of course, after all this, I still hear, no, it's winters and coyotes, Rod, it's winters and coyotes. And you know what? The same thing happens all around us. So I said, really? So I called my buddies in the deer world. I called my deer buddy in Maine. I called my deer buddies in Quebec and Nova Scotia. And I said, guys, I need your deer numbers for the last 30 years. Bingo. Got them all just lickety split. So, this is in 1985, what we were harvesting for deer. The red is in 2015. Okay, so this is what we harvested in 1985 and 2015. This is New Brunswick. Isn't that awesome? We are harvesting 14% of the deer we had in 1985. Well, Maine is right beside us. How's Maine doing? Hardly changed in 30 years. In Quebec, where they banned herbicide in 2000, they have a 300% increase in deer in Quebec. Now people, that says something, okay? And the next time we have this little debate in the media or whatever, I'm going to have these things. We're going to talk about this. Because people need to respond to this. That is dismal. There's something serious going on here with the deer population. So then what I usually get told here is they say, well, yeah, but that growth in deer in Maine, that's in southern Maine. Well, we still have southern New Brunswick in here, don't forget, but I'll give you that. Okay, and let's look at northern Maine, which is very similar to New Brunswick, and let's look at the Gaspé Peninsula, which is very close to New Brunswick. Let's look at those. So, since 2007, the last peak in New Brunswick, when we harvested 10,000 deer, last year, 2015, we've had a 60% decline in New Brunswick over those 5 years. Nova Scotia has seen a 22% decline. What's that, a third? Northeastern Maine, same exact climate, coyotes, everything else as we have, they've only seen a 35, half the decline we have. Gaspé Peninsula, even less than that again. And they're farther north. They have harder winters. And if it's winters and coyotes, why is Quebec growing more deer than New Brunswick? Coincidence. Must be just a fluke, I think. These are things that people cannot answer. So, this is not the only problem. This is my problem, okay? My beef is with deer, okay? And I don't mind talking about deer. If I get outside of that, I get my knuckles wrapped usually, but the changes came about so slowly, people were asleep at the wheel. Again, it's that frog in the kettle thing. It was so gradual over time, and we all went out as kids and had a little potted tree seedlings and planted in the ground. Oh, we're doing a great thing, regenerating the forest. And we always thought that's a good thing, and it is a good thing. But at the scale we're doing it, and where it's happening, and how much it's having a big effect. And we're just starting to realize that now. The debate over the conservation forest, that's the big picture. And this is one factor in that. You guys, you need to, whenever we talk about the forestry issue, people need to realize there's a big thing going on out there that is not helpful to us or our wildlife. Dropping the conservation forest to 22% means we've lowered all that habitat for animals on Crown land. And once it's gone, it's gone. It is not coming back. And everything we're planting is for a 60-year rotation. So thinking we're going to get those big mature trees back sometime is not happening. You're dreaming if you think that's going to happen. And I've been out in some of these areas that when this was happening, we went out and cruised a bunch. There's some beautiful spots up there still left in that conservation forest. But it's disappearing rapidly right now. So in 2012, DNR biologists warned about the adverse effects of dropping that down to 22%. Then from 2012 to 2014, the guys that I worked with, that I was trying to convince of this, they actually worked the numbers and went, holy cow, this is bad. We're going to lose 9 species of wildlife at 23% in conservation forest. Pine marten, fisher, a northern flying squirrel, owls, pileated woodpeckers, all those animals are gone on Crown land at 23%. Okay, and they knew that. And they started, so they went upstairs and told senior people in DNR, now all 5 of those guys all have different jobs. They all have different jobs. And they're scared to death to say anything. They're scared to death to say anything because they're worried they're going to lose their job like Clary did. Does everybody know about Dr. Clary? Well, Clary lost her job. But I want to talk about that because basically what's happened is when I started speaking out, all of a sudden it was amazing. Industry, urban, industry and DNR and FPL, they all got together and said, oh, we're going to lose herbicide. We have to stop it. And they all got together like little buddies, and they had their meetings every week, and they said, we got to plan a strategy to stop this. And they did. They developed a brand new website. It's called, it's not herbicide anymore, it's called vegetation management. And you can go on that website and you can see how great it is. Because it's great, and it doesn't affect wildlife, it doesn't affect anything. And you can read all about it there on their website. Then what they also did, they hired this Dr. Len Ritter. He's a toxicologist from the University of Guelph, and he's answering all the questions to this website. So when people get on there like me and say, what do you mean by this? We mean, all of a sudden you get a letter back from Dr. Ritter, who's an expert in toxicology, and says, everything's fine. So I did a little work on Dr. Ritter, because he and I had a few emails back and forth. And whenever Ritter would email me, he would copy Irving, DNR, and Forest New Brunswick. And I thought, oh, that's weird. Oh, he's copying all those guys on something to me. So I would write back, and the first few times we went back and forth a little bit congenial, but then once I did a little bit of work on Dr. Ritter and found out who he really was, and I sent a little bit more sparkly email. And I said, Mr. Ritter, you've got a pretty interesting resume. You know, you're the guy that defended Agent Orange on base H-Town, and he's done all kinds of interesting things. He's always the guy defending the industry on these chemicals. And when I brought that up, boys, he was out of the picture in a flash. And I guess he's not even on the website anymore, right? His name's down at the bottom now, I hear. So he took a step back a bit from that, because I think they realized all of a sudden people are cluing into what's going on. But I'll talk about him in a bit. He's also the guy involved. Right now what's happening is there's a big review federally on glyphosate. Okay, all this research has come up in the last 5 to 10 years. There's been all kinds of research done all around the world saying glyphosate is problematic. It's hugely toxic. Long-term studies are showing it's a carcinogen. There's lots of problems with glyphosate. And when that started happening, there was a review by Health Canada that said, we've got to review glyphosate again. So all of a sudden, Health Canada, who's supposed to be our agency looking after our health, said, yep, let's review it. And they did a review. They put out their 355-page document in 2014. Sorry, 2015. It was late. It's supposed to come out 2014. Well, 2015, and I read it through from cover to cover, and I could not believe it. It was written by scientists. Unbelievable. And the guy behind it, Dr. Ritter. What a surprise. Dr. Cleary was let go, obviously, in the fall of 2015. But if you remember, at Christmas time, in all the Irving papers, there was a huge one-page spread that said, we believe in science. And whatever the Department of Health says about the review on glyphosate, we're going to stand behind it. And I thought, yep, I know why. Because the same guy you hired to look after your website is the guy behind this. So you got nothing to lose. So anyways, I'll talk about those problems in a bit. Now the new Chief Medical Health Officer, the acting one right now, she just came out with her report on glyphosate. And of course, right off the bat, in all the papers, it said, oh, glyphosate's good to use, business as usual. And I thought, holy cow, what did she look at? So I read through her report, and it's amazing what's going on. The 3 main goals that are stated right in her document determine how other provinces deal with it. So find out what other provinces do. Look at PMRA, EPA, so these are all the agencies, regulatory agencies that say whether you can use it or not. And they all suffer from this same problem that I'll get to in a minute. And then the research that they used, well, they were going to research the use patterns in Canada. So, or in New Brunswick, and how do we compare to the rest of the country? And what they found out was we use a ton more glyphosate in the forest industry than they do anywhere else in Canada. Despite our small size, we are second in land area sprayed in the nation. Second, behind Ontario. And a third of all the glyphosate used in forestry in Canada is used right here in New Brunswick. Merry Christmas. They're claim to fame. So again, and then the other thing they're all saying is, oh, we're going to look at what Health Canada says. Just like the guy in this video from Oregon, the similarities are unbelievable. The parallel between there and here is unbelievable. Because the first thing that guy said to defending the industry, oh well, we're just going by what the label says and what EPA says. They all fall right back to these regulatory agencies. And if the regulatory agencies are at arm's length and doing their job like they should, everything would be good. But we know that isn't what's happening. Not whatsoever. It's a big game. Health Canada review, it's supposed to be a health review. In the first 3 pages, it talks about the economic and social benefits of glyphosate. But it's a scientific review, and that was the first comment I made. You call this a scientific review, and you tout all the, It's so important economically, and all my graces, the social benefits from the jobs. Are you worried about the science and health or not? That's politics. When there's politics in the first 3 pages of this review, it told me right off the bat, this isn't scientific. The other thing, glyphosate by itself is not how it's used. When we spray it in New Brunswick, it's got adjuvants and emulsifiers mixed in with it so it sticks to leaves and does what it does. Those things are hugely toxic. And there was a letter just in the Gleaner yesterday by Dr. Rod Savage from UNB that talked about all these, what are they called, anyways, emulsifiers and adjuvants, so the additives to glyphosate. And he went on about how toxic they were and how her review fell way short of what it should do. These things are terrible. And all the research done in the last 10 years, worldwide, outside of industry, showed that these things it makes glyphosate 1,000 times more toxic than we thought it was. It's bad stuff. But the review looks at just glyphosate by itself. And I wrote and said, how in the world can you assess glyphosate by itself if it's not used by itself? It's used in formulation. You have to test it in formulation. If we're worried about our health, we want to test it in the form that it's going to be sprayed on us or on whatever. 80% of the research using it was short-term, industry-funded, and more than 15 years old. So I sent them my 45 papers that are in the last 10 years that show that it's hugely toxic. Anyhow, and of course, Ritter's ready to helm that. So, in summary, deer numbers always fluctuate, okay? And people that talk about winters and coyotes, yes, that will cause short-term fluctuations in deer numbers. But it's a lot. If you try to grow a deer herd and it only goes this high, that tells you something. If we had all kinds of land out there and there was no shortage of food, if the herd would grow again to 31,000. And it didn't. We only made 1/3 of that. And when they do increase, they increase on private land where there is food, where there's stuff that they like to eat. So in my mind, that's a huge... When I saw this stuff here, I said, this is not the time to be a deer biologist. Because the hunters are going to hate you because they can't get at them. And everybody else is going to hate you because they're growing in places that nobody wants them. So it's time for me to take a different career. All the deer yards on Crown land are vacated. And again, the big question here is, well, why? How did that happen? How did we set aside all this land, government set aside all this land to help deer, and it's no use to deer? That is a travesty. There's all kinds of animals in the northwest part of the province. Like, maybe we should do whatever they're doing up there because they're doing something good up there. They got all kinds of deer, moose, and trout. Somebody should figure out what's going on there. The other thing is, if it's coyotes in winters, I live in Keswick Ridge, and out, you just drive a little ways due west, and you're out in Crab Mountain. And there are no deer out there at Crab Mountain, and there's all kinds of deer in Keswick Ridge. And actually, we have more coyotes than they do because we have deer. And the winters are exactly the same. So if it's coyotes in winters, somebody needs to explain to me how that happens all across New Brunswick. Because I'm sure right here, if we went out here, we'd see that there's all kinds of deer up and down this river valley. And once you get out into those crown lands, there's no deer there. Well, how different is the winter? Somebody needs to explain that to me, okay? Because they keep throwing this coyotes and winters out there. That holds no water to me at all. Deer are herbivore. They need something to eat. And Dr. Peter Peekins from the University of New Hampshire said that you can overwinter deer in a parking lot as long as they have food to eat. And for years and years, we've been so focused on cover, 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 because of course we're going to lose it. And all of our deer yards, it's all about cover. And we're asleep at the wheel on food. And as soon as you mention food, the answer is always, oh, there's lots of food. Really? Well, somebody needs to quantify that. Because I did quantify it, and the picture looks a whole lot different than what they're telling us. So anyways, that's my view of the deer world in the last 15 to 20 years. And to be wise, I should stick with deer and not get into a whole lot else. But again, there's lots of things here that are unexplainable, okay? Or they are explainable if you look at a little bit bigger picture. So anyways, thank you.